We are back today with Dr. Dean after a brief hiatus. You were on vacation?
Yes, I was. Last week we celebrated our 6th wedding anniversary. So
Cool.
Goes very quick. Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, no, definitely. We a lot of people missed you. I got a lot of DMs of people asking if you were going to come back, and I said, it's just a temporary thing. He went away for 1 week. We'll be back.
I'm glad I'm having such good popularity. It's been fun so far.
Very cool. Yeah, I think you and I kind of have a similar mission that we're just trying to bring the actual science here so much without an opinion. So there was some interesting stuff going on the internet lately about halotestin. So I just figured we could do a brief summary of how halotestin works and why it's not necessarily a first call steroid and why it's not necessarily the safest steroid, because the posts that we've seen recently were basically recommending it for use.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason why it was being recommended for use was because there's I guess an outdated paper that showed that when halotestin was used by a small subset of men, LH and FSH didn't downregulate, which means that it didn't suppress the HPTA. But I guess the oxynorm to it is, whilst LH and FSH didn't decrease, total testosterone within the study did.
Yep.
And we discussed before we came on that, to me, that makes no sense unless something structurally has gone wrong with the LH receptor, whereby it's not inducing steroidogenesis within the mitochondria of the testes. But the other argument then against that is, then why wouldn't we see secondary hypogonadism occur if there was a faulty mechanism at the LH receptor of the testes, that the brain would be told, well, pump out more LH to overcome this issue? So maybe the data is flawed from that study.
Could be dosing.
There's there's no arguing that, in theory, halotestin potentially might not shut down the HPTA, knowing that what drives gonadotropin releasing hormone secretion is estradiol. So when estradiol levels are too high, the neurons back off and don't pulse to the pituitary. And that's why when you take a higher level of androgens than what you make physiologically, it shuts the HPTA down. It's not the androgen of itself that's telling the brain don't fire. It's your estradiol level has gone too high beyond where you were programmed genetically. And so your brain now makes the assumption that estradiol has gone too high, therefore testosterone is too high, stop pulsing to the pituitary. And that's how the HPTA shuts down. With halotestin, we're having a look at the chemical structure in 2D, and then we took it one step further to 3D, and it makes sense, the fact that whilst halotestin can aromatize, in theory, we don't really see it observably happen. And we were looking at the structure. So I think we'll throw the structure up.
That's just the flat. We can do if you have the ball and stick, we can look at that as well, because that's more interesting. So most people are used to looking at chemical structures in this format. And what we were talking about offline is that it's a 3-dimensional thing. This is just the flat representation. So it's misleading, and people don't understand what the dotted wedges and the solid wedges mean. We can show that in a second. I was just going to say, so to back up a second so people understand. So the chemical name is fluoxymesterone. It was first discovered in 1956 and first introduced for medical use in 1957. It has a very limited use under the FDA for approval, at least in the United States. It is still approved, and it can be used in terminal breast cancer in women that's inoperable, and it can be used in total bone marrow failure in advanced cancer. So that's pretty much the only thing. It's very rarely used. It's used at end of life stages because it is very toxic. Do you want to bring, if you have the ball and stick, we can.
Yeah, let's share my screen here. So this will come up now in a second. So we see in there, obviously, this is a little bit more advanced now, and that it's just for clarity, it's showing the representation of the atoms again more accurately in space than what we see with just up and down and the other flat. But being chemists, this is actually what fluoxymesterone or halotestin looks in 3D space. So it's not just a matter of having this flat cyclopentaphenanthracene ring. This is how it exists in three-dimensional space. So we often see the ball and stick, which is just an easier way to visualize the atoms themselves. But if we go with space filling basically makes the assumption of the electron clouds around each atom and how much space those atoms take up in three-dimensional space. So if we look at a ball and stick, just to make it a lot easier to look at, let's turn it round so I can explain a bit easier what's going on. So I'll try and keep this here so I can show pointer references. So what we see here obviously is carbonyl C3, and we have C4 and C5 here. We've got C19 sticking up. So basically that's what that wedge is signifying, that it's pointing up. And then a sort of dashed line means it's pointing down or to the back. And we can see that if I rotate this, there is our fluorine atom pointing down.
And that's what really makes this unique, right? So when these drugs are designed, so metabolites affect the androgenic and the anabolic properties of the drug as well as the original structure. But when these drugs are designed, if we want to make something specifically androgenic, we generally modify carbon 9 and carbon 11. Those tend to be the two, and you see that in halotestin and you see it in trembolone. That's why those tend to be the most androgenic.
Exactly. And then the other thing is, we know that adding, generally we can do it with, I guess how halotestin came about is it is halogenated androgens. So it's the halogens are fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. So we tend to favor fluorine because of how large it is and how much of an electrostatic interaction it has for, I guess, creating hydrogen bonding, to speak. That's generally what we tend to use these halogenated atoms for. And fluorine tends to then increase the half-life of a compound also. Like if we look at, I guess, we have fluorinated modafinil, which extends the half-life of modafinil when it's fluorinated. So when we add these fluorine groups on, it basically slows down the metabolism of them because of how difficult it is to remove that halogenated atom. So by having this guy here, what we were talking about with aromatization is basically carbon abstraction, where you pull away that carbon 19 metal group, and basically the electrons from here flow into C5, C6, and it basically cyclizes into an aromatic ring, so aromatase aromatic ring. But because we've got this fluorine group, it's probably a lot difficult for the iron atom of aromatase to come in and form its interaction with that carbon 19.
It's difficult, but it's possible, supposedly. I mean, supposedly there is still some aromatization that can occur, and there's been reported gynemastica from this, but it's obviously rare.
It's rare, but again, when we look at how it occupies in space, it can come in and take that away because the fluorine is underneath. But in terms of how the electrons will distribute, like I said, these electrons flow down into C5 and C6, and then this closes. If we look from underneath, difficult, there's the representation of those two carbons here and here, where the fluorine is sitting underneath. So again, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult given this the charge space of this. So I guess when we're looking at these molecules, you have to really pay attention to how they are occupying three-dimensional space, how the rings have angles themselves based off the substituents inside. And we can find, I guess an example would be testosterone, where we wouldn't have I guess the easiest way to explain this from a chemist perspective is like a chair.
Mhm.
There's the back of your chair. Testosterone tends to be a little more plainer because we don't have this angular distortion. And so if we know that the receptor interaction perspective, that C3's carbonyl is very important for binding, and then up here is very important for binding.
And
And
carbon 11 as well.
Carbon 11 out here.
There's
I guess
there. That should stop some aromatization as well.
that's exactly it. I guess we have to view how that shape changes in 3D space also, and for how it has the affinity for the receptor. So I think that's today's chemistry lesson aside.
Yes, and so obviously it's also methylated at carbon 17, right? Like most other orals, I think the only two that proviron is not, and pyrimidine acetate is not as well. But most are in order to survive. So it's got like an 80%, give or take, oral bioavailability, but it is, this one tends to be more hepatotoxic than most. And that's generally, that you generally go by half-life and how androgenic something is. And those two factors tend to contribute to how much liver damage it's actually going to do. And this seems to be not great in both of those areas.
And I guess the main side effect, so I guess we have to view that when these compounds are being metabolized, they're occurring within the CYP enzymes of each hepatocyte within the liver. And for anyone who doesn't have any sort of background in pharmacology or any sort of toxicology, these enzymes are remarkable. Like it's basically like being gods with chemistry. These enzymes can do stuff that we cannot do in a lab. Like when we try and understand some of the mechanisms of like oxidation or hydroxylation of what these enzymes can do. I remember during my degree, some of them are physically impossible to do in a lab setting. Yet our body can somehow do these transformations. How? I don't know. But when we look at the metabolites, effectively, when we metabolize something like fluoxymesterone, we have to demethylate carbon 17, so that metal group comes away, and now all of a sudden we can now hydroxylate or oxidize the hydroxyl group on carbon 17. So all of a sudden that OH becomes a carbonyl, and that all of a sudden changes the electrostatic interaction of the molecule. So it's no longer technically halotestin, it's been changed into a metabolite of the drug. And so now that will have a different binding affinity because it's now a double bond O instead of a COH. But in doing those transformation processes, you induce microsomal injury to these enzymes because of how toxic the removal of that metal group is. So for anyone that doesn't really understand, metal groups in our body are pretty much what we use to switch on and off genes through methylation. So they're very, very reactive. They're donated onto specific gene sequences in order to turn that sequence on or off. Similarly, when we remove that metal group, it has to go somewhere. So the enzyme is going to accept that metal group, and it's going to change the structure of the enzyme itself. Obviously, then that changes the structure of the enzyme. So in theory, that enzyme could get damaged and no longer can participate in another reaction. So a new enzyme is created in I guess, replacement of it. If that insult continues without sort of a rate of repair, you end up with hepatocytes, probably to start cell injury. If that continues, you end up with a level of fibrosis where the cells are no longer being repaired. And then from there, you have obviously cirrhosis and hepatocarcinoma, where you start developing cancer cells because the cell has become dysfunctional.
Correct.
One of the things that we have to consider with these orals as well is cholestasis, where again, when we damage those liver hepatocyte cells, inside our liver cells are bile ducts where bile flows through from the gallbladder to effectively pull fat from the liver down into the small intestine. If cholestasis happens where the cholesterol crystallizes, or we've destroyed those bile ducts, you have this bile that's coming from the gallbladder to effectively like rinse the liver to emulsify fats. if it has nowhere to go, you have what's called bile backflow, and the bile basically takes all this debris and crap with it back.
Yep.
And again, it further damages the other hepatocytes that the bile is backflowing across. So definitely when it looks towards the use of these compounds, you have to really understand that the liver itself is what's taking the brunt of it. And I remember reading a fascinating paper, and I shared this years ago, and you probably know this, but your mesenchymal stem cells, so everyone knows that their liver can regenerate. We can lose about 60% of our liver and regrow it back because of our stem cell capability. Androgen receptor activation in your liver stops stem cell infiltration. And this is one of the mechanisms why we see hepatic carcinoma cases in steroid users, is because of this whole blasting and cruising, where they're always at a super physiological level between blasting or cruising. So yeah, that's it. The androgen receptor, the liver is constantly activates, so the stem cells are blocked from coming in. And that's why it's important, especially if orals are used in like a contest prep setting and there is potential risk for that liver cell injury, that you go to a physiological level of androgens post-use in order to allow the liver to, I guess, regenerate or heal what has been damaged, if anything. And again, it comes down to, like I said, bile flow, cholestasis, bile viscosity, dietary fat intake, dietary fat transport across the liver. There's so many things that play in, in the hierarchy. The methylation of the androgen is only one part of what feeds into 7 or 8 different factors.
Yep. Yeah. So the other metabolism of this is like 6 beta hydroxylation, 5 alpha and beta reduction, 3 alpha and 3 beta keto oxidation, and 11 beta hydroxyoxidation. And then there's 2 known metabolites of this drug, at least that we're aware of currently: a dihydrofluoxymesterone and an oxyfluoxymesterone.
And then there's been, I guess, one of the things, like you said, in terms of like the cancer use, the anti-cancer properties of it, it's very interesting. Obviously, like what we discussed before with Masteron, going back and looking at the metabolites of Masteron. Again, there could be interest at some point revisiting some of the metabolites of this. But from like a day-to-day steroid use, if someone said to me, right, 5 or 10 milligrams of halotestin every day, there's no HPTA shutdown, your LH and FSH is still going to go. The next question is then, well, what are the other side effects? And again, you look at the liver toxicity, and probably of them all, like the dosage that's used of halotestin approval, from what I remember, ranges from 2.5 up
10.
to, I think, a max of 10.
Yep. Clinically, yes. And then in performance, generally the highest people go is about 40.
40.
I mean, I've heard of certain larger strength athletes potentially using more, but I'm not sure why anyone would ever use more than 40 milligrams.
It's definitely, anyone who's tried it, it definitely brings on very strong androgenicity. And I mean, within
days.
And I mean, within 60 minutes pre-workout, if you've got a relatively empty stomach, it will hit fairly quick. And it's one of those ones that if your personality sets you up for excessive dopamine, you will get very aggressive, or you will have not a change in personality, but a change in temperament.
Yes.
That can be like almost viewed that you're an arsehole.
Yes. And it flips also back and forth with depression.
It does.
It's a very odd behaving drug.
I guess just from not I wouldn't say cherry picking, but looking at one study where LH and FSH didn't get suppressed to make a global recommendation of its uses, it's just a little absurd, given what level of, I guess, derangement it causes in the body. And again, I don't know about you, but my view when it comes to like oral androgens, because of the fact that they tend to favor non-genomic sequences of working. So for for anyone who's never really heard of that, you have obviously genomic, where you have the androgen receptor forming a complex with the androgen itself going to the nucleus, creating an androgen response element, which turns on a gene. And then that gene can be whatever we're seeking for, whether it's, increased nitrogen retention, upregulation of ribosome delivery, whatever we're going to focus in on. The non-genomic acts on actually the cell membrane itself.
Yep, there's
change
a receptor on the cell membrane.
On the cell membrane, which changes the voltage of the cell membrane. So it's all related to intracellular calcium signaling.
It brings calcium in.
And depending on what that cell is, if it's a neuron, increased calcium means fire more neurotransmitter. If it's skeletal muscle cells or the nervous system, increased calcium flux basically contracts. So you need to increase strength. So that tends to be where we see these oral androgens play favorably.
Within seconds of administration.
Yeah. And then you have obviously fancy ways of getting around hepatic delivery of buccal, people putting these tablets under their tongue.
Yeah.
And
with circulation, it's still going to go through the liver at some point.
It is. So, with how people are viewing this compound, in my mind, Anavar, Anadrol, this, for example, should only be deployed in a pre-training scenario. So it's definitely not something you're going to be taking every day to augment muscle protein synthesis, because it just doesn't have that same effect as what something like a DHT derivative like Primobolan or Mastron would have. Yeah. You're using this for a very specific purpose, and that's either driving neurochemistry or driving the nervous system.
Or both, right? And some red blood cell volume as well.
Yeah.
Bodybuilders use it before a show, right?
You'd use it before food. Yeah, you've got probably a myriad. You've either got fluoxymesterone, Anadrol, or in some places metasterone, Superdrol. So in that instance, you're doing the same, like you said, just increased volumization, some more red blood cells, so you have a fuller appearance to your physique. But it's a temporary solution that's used like 2 or 3 days before a show to change hemodynamics, as opposed to something that you'd run for 4 or 5 months.
Correct. Yeah. The longest I've usually would see would maybe 3 or 4 weeks at the longest, right? But it's usually like this last 2 or 3 weeks. And for bodybuilding, last 2 or 3 weeks, maybe powerlifting, it's shorter term, more acute.
Yeah.
That's it. It's generally strength right before contest. Right. Anadrol would probably be more predictable with strength and a little bit, I hate to say a little bit safer, because Anadrol's not safe either. But Anadrol can be more unpredictable though with its appearance, right? Some people hold water from it.
Yeah, from the
Halotestin tends on average to be a little drier, so it tends to be considered safer before a contest, at least.
I think one of the uses that I've seen also that halotestin's been recommended for its use as a safer drug is because of it has mineral corticoid antagonist properties.
Yeah, so because it's very similar in structure with 9 and 11. Carbon 9 and 11 are almost the same.
Yeah, so you end up in this scenario where people are like, oh, well, it's going to suppress cortisol secretion and it's going to have this favorable effect over onto metabolism and homeostatic regulation. But to me, again, it's just not something that you want to promote as being a daily safe molecule to have in your body as a sole androgen.
No, and for women and children, it seems even more absurd, right? So it's such a strong androgenic drug that it actually fixed micropenis in small children. So it's the only drug that's actually even shown in that situation. It's not going to do it in someone who does not experience that, but it's actually caused penile growth. That's how strong of an androgen is. So giving it to women seems kind of ridiculous. And nor would it be considered necessarily hair safe. I don't know where this whole new thing with hair. I was going to do a video later today. You and I can even do one on DHT levels in the blood and how that actually doesn't really impact anything. It's more the androgen receptor that has to do with its T crossing over.
Yeah, so I covered on SN of hair growth, mechanisms of hair loss, and then the treatment of androgenic alopecia. Mm-hmm. We can definitely do a podcast on hair loss, people tend to just focus on like DHT being this driver of hair loss or, you know, hair safety. But there's 7 mechanisms to hair loss. A hormone disruption, DHT being one hormone in that class, is one of the things. You've got several other factors, like you've got thyroid excess, you've got vitaminosis where you have excessive vitamin A or vitamin K, you've got all these other things. You've got lack of estrogen and too much DHT or too much testosterone causing potential issues, because like what we discussed before, estrogen tends to promote a level of angiogenesis and blood flow. So if you have low estrogen, your scalp needs blood flow to bring nutrients to the hair follicles for the hair follicles to regenerate and grow. You have inflammatory signaling within the hair follicle itself. So you've got like several pathways, and this is where me as a chemist versus like a biologist, you have like the WNT pathway, you have the beta catechin, you have sonic hedgehog. There's about 6 or 7 of them that I remember reading about. Now I'm no huge expert in dealing with molecular biology mechanisms and pathways, but some of these mechanisms, from how I like to view things as simple as possible, play into like what you said there, an inflammatory response whereby I guess you either have destruction of the hair follicle and the stem cells that are inside the hair follicle, so the hair follicle can no longer grow. And also, we have to view hair loss as being either temporary, where the hair follicle has been put into an arrest state, so the hair follicle is still active, just not being told to grow, or the hair follicle has become scarred, where you're never going to grow that hair. And that's sort of where you can have a period of, if you understand what's happening with your hair loss, you want to stop it from turning into that irreversible scarred alopecia. And androgenic alopecia tends to start as a non-scarring alopecia. But if we don't correct that imbalance and get the signaling to the hair follicle to start telling the stem cells to grow the dermapapilla, you're going to end up in a position where the hair follicle dies, and the only way you're getting the hair follicle to grow again is putting a donor hair into the follicle. So yeah, we can definitely do a chat over that.
There's a lot of new data with cancer too, and circulating DHT, and how that's not even a relevant factor anymore.
It's, you know, I think one of the things when we look at hair loss from like the androgenic alopecia side tends to be more so like the total amount of androgens that's going around the body, but then it's all the different metabolic pathways that are being affected by that, as opposed to singling in on one specific molecule being the cause of it. So yeah, we can. I'd be interested.
We could always do that next. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, we'll do that next week then.
Well, I thank everyone for joining us. Please like and subscribe. Dr. Dean's link tree will be down below. Thank you, everyone.